Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is a Libertarian Angle. As many of you know, for many years now, we have concentrated many of our articles and our talks and our conferences on the theme of the national security state, or also known as the war state. And what I thought I'd do today is share with you some of the roots of this apparatus that was attached to our governmental system, and specifically dealing with the Cold War and the anti-communist crusade and the fundamental altering that came to our governmental system because of this national security state. President Eisenhower alluded to this fundamental change in America's governmental system when he delivered his farewell address in 1961. He pointed out that this apparatus that he called the military industrial complex constituted a fundamental change in America's governmental system. That before then, whenever there had been a war, the big standing military establishment had been dismantled and the troops discharged into the private sector. That's not what happened after World War II. And Eisenhower pointed out that this is a new way of life now, where you have this giant military establishment, a permanent military establishment, represented by the Pentagon and an empire of foreign and domestic military bases. You got the CIA, you have the NSA, and Eisenhower pointed out that this way of life was alien to the founding principles of this country. It was something new. Now Eisenhower said, well, this is necessary, that has become necessary because of the Cold War, something that we'll talk about today. But nonetheless, he says this is a different way of life than Americans have ever experienced. And he went further than that. He says this apparatus constitutes a grave threat to our freedoms and democratic processes here in the United States. Now, the way this apparatus came into existence was as a result of the Cold War that was launched at the end of World War II. That was when we got the National Security Act, which brought into existence the Defense Department, the giant military establishment as a permanent basis, the CIA, and later the NSA. There's people that think that, well, this was just another part of the government. But yet, as it's developed, I would suggest that it developed into something much different than that. While we ostensibly think that it came about as part of the executive branch of the government, and the military and the CIA are answerable to the president, as we've seen in various works dealing with what's called the deep state, or in a recent book that I absolutely love and highly recommend called National Security and Double Government, the author Michael Glennon, who teaches, I think, at Tufts University, referred to it as a double government. His thesis is that when the national security state apparatus came into existence, that it essentially became the center of power of the federal government. That is, it's the information gathering arm. That's what his major thesis is. I would add to that that this is also where all the guns and the tanks and the planes are centered. Glennon called it a double government, where you have the illusion, the aura that the old original government still operating the way it had always operated, with three branches of government, the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. But that the real center of power under the radar screen is this double government that he calls it, called the national security state. I look at it a different way. I look at it, the national security apparatus, as a fourth branch of government. It's the national security branch of government. And in fact, it is the most powerful branch of government. So while Glennon looks at it in terms of the Trumanite section of government, creating this illusion that the Madisonian section, as he calls it, is still in power, while the real power rests with the Trumanite section, I look at it in terms of just the fourth branch. At the fourth branch of government, the national security branch is the most powerful form of government, and that's essentially why the Supreme Court defers to it, in creating this zone of immunity around assassinations and torture and other kidnappings and other things that the national security state does. There's an acknowledgement that this is the most powerful government and that there are red lines that cannot be crossed, even while the national security branch makes it look like, oh, the judiciary is still in charge and the president's still in charge and so forth. Well, what happened here we have to go back to World War II. Recall that Franklin Roosevelt, who was president, wanted was doing everything he could to get America involved in World War II. The American people didn't want to have anything to do with it. I mean, they had seen the horrific consequences of World War I, this foreign war that did not involve the United States. It was going to make the world safe for democracy. This was going to be the war to end all wars. Going back to World War I, President Wilson was thinking, boy, I can come in here and with overwhelming American power, and we can finally settle European wars once and for all. And it had turned out to be a disaster. In fact, it's pretty well acknowledged that World War I, the results of it gave rise to World War II. It was really just one long continuous war. And so by the time Roosevelt's coming along trying to get the United States involved in the war, the American people are saying, no, we want nothing to do with this thing. And well, Roosevelt was trying to goad the Germans into attacking in the Atlantic. That didn't work, so he goes into the Pacific looking for a backdoor to war and provoking the Japanese with the sanctions and the embargoes and the freezing of their accounts and the humiliating negotiating terms that he was imposing on them, all with the idea that if he could get the Japanese to attack, he's got America into the war and hopefully then get America into the European side of the conflict. Well, it worked. And so we're into the war. Now, why did Great Britain declare war on Germany in the first place? Well, because Germany had invaded Poland. And Great Britain said this is an act of aggression, and we need to correct it. We need to free the people of Poland from this Nazi tyranny. Well, so the United States ends up getting into this war alongside with Great Britain, but sides at the same time with the Soviet communists, the Soviet Union. Now, the irony of this is that shortly after Germany had invaded Poland, so did the Soviet Union, pursuant to an agreement that the Soviet communists had with the German Nazis. And so it was ironic that later, when Great Britain and the United States are waging war against Germany for having invaded Poland with the intent to free Poland from German tyranny, they're siding with Germany's partner in this endeavor, the Soviet Union, the communists. Now, another interesting aspect of this is that while we look at Nazi Germany in terms of the Holocaust, and rightfully so, well, what a lot of people don't realize is that in the early years of the Hitler regime, his primary focus was the communists. Yes, in other words, Hitler had his Cold War first, before America did, before Great Britain did. He was going after communists in Germany, and he was using gun control and gun registration and gun laws to focus in on communists. He would have searches of their homes looking for communists, and if he'd find guns, he'd prosecute them. He'd send them away to jail for violating Germany's gun control laws. And the entire idea was that the communists posed a grave threat to Germany. So here we get into the war, and the United States gets into the war with the communists as a partner, the Soviet Union. At the end of the war, not surprisingly, by the time the Soviets have reached Berlin, they're not real interested in letting go of Eastern Europe. In fact, as part of the Yalta Treaty and the Yalta meeting where Roosevelt was there with Stalin and Churchill, they essentially delivered Eastern Europe into the clutches of their Soviet partners. In fact, when anyone would suggest that, hey, maybe we ought to reach a negotiated peace with Germany, before the Soviets had come back into Eastern Europe on their way back to Berlin, after they reversed the tide in the Soviet Union, Roosevelt would respond, no. That would be a double cross against our communist partners. That we've got to have an unconditional surrender here, and we're all in this together. So by the time the Soviets reach Berlin, they're obviously not very interested in letting in some independent regimes in Eastern Europe, because that would open the door for another German invasion. They wanted a buffer. But interestingly enough, at this point, you've got this huge military establishment that had its roots in World War I, but then all of a sudden came into full fruition in World War II. And they were not about to go away at the end of this war. The enormous military establishment, the Pentagon, you're talking about the OSS that develops into the CIA. They're saying, we're here to stay. But they needed a rationale in order to stay in existence because, like I say, as Eisenhower was saying, this would be an entirely new type of apparatus for America. It was really in the nature of a totalitarian-like apparatus. Huge military establishment, glorification of the military, militarism in society, overseas and domestic military bases, spying, surveillance schemes, not exactly consistent with a free society. But the argument was that we're now facing a new official enemy. So they'd gotten rid of one official enemy, Nazi Germany, but quickly replaced it with another official enemy, the Soviet Union, who had been their partner. And they said that now we have to convert the Soviet Union into a new official enemy because it's not leaving Eastern Europe like it's supposed to. It's not letting independent regimes there, and that means it's bent on world conquest. The Soviet Union is going to come and get us. The communists are coming to get us, which was a ridiculous notion from the very beginning. I mean, the Soviets had lost about 20 million people in World War II, while the United States had lost a few 100,000. Their entire industrial capacity had been destroyed, while the United States industrial capacity had not been touched. And perhaps most important, the United States had nuclear weapons, while the Soviet Union did not. And the United States had leaders who were more than willing to use nuclear weapons against highly populated areas. So the idea that the Soviets at the end of World War II were in any position or had any interest in world conquest, including coming over to the United States and conquering America, is ridiculous. But in that time, Americans deferred to authority. There was this mindset of deference to authority, of trusting government. So when the national security state, the Pentagon, and then later the CIA said the communists are coming to get us, this is a grave threat to America's security, most Americans simply deferred to authority. Now, this was a watershed event in American life. It actually is bigger than Roosevelt's watershed event with respect to the welfare state, where during the Great Depression, Roosevelt's New Deal transformed the function of the federal government on a domestic side to take care of people. That was what the whole welfare state, the whole concept of socialism was about, that government would be a paternalistic entity. They would provide Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and so forth for farm subsidies, aid to dictatorships and so forth, all with the design of taking care of people. And so now you've got this other watershed event called the national security state that comes into existence in the late 1940s, or pretty much right after World War II is finished. And again, both events, the welfare state and the warfare state, they come into existence without any constitutional amendment. I mean, that's our system, that if you want to change the system, change your government system in a fundamental way, you got to go through constitutional amendment. They didn't do that. They used fear to adopt a revolutionary restructuring of America's governmental system through the attachment of a welfare state apparatus and the attachment of a warfare state apparatus. They don't even go through the semblance of a constitutional amendment. And it fundamentally changed America's way of life. I mean, here were the beginnings of what we have today, the assassination program, the torture program, the whole war on terrorism, the regime change operations, the sanctions, the embargoes. It all has its roots in this national security state apparatus. And that's why it's so important to go back historically to understand how we got where we are today, why it happened, and why it's necessary to get rid of the root, to pull the weed out by its root in order to resolve the problems that we're facing today. You can see that the horrific things that were already starting to happen. Now, we've always been told that the CIA hired a few Nazis after World War II, but just recently we learned that the CIA actually hired at least 1,000, maybe more, Nazi officials as part of the federal government. Now, they kept it secret. They didn't want Americans to understand that they were doing this. I mean, imagine Here we had just gone to war against the German government, telling Americans that the Nazis were bent on world conquest and so forth. And now all of a sudden, you've got the CIA hiring the officials that really should have been brought up on war crimes, including officials who have participated in the Holocaust. And then you've got the MK Ultra experiments, which were medical experimentations on unsuspecting Americans. I mean, that's absolutely incredible. And again, it was kept top secret for the American people in the world. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they put some of those Nazis, those 1,000 Nazis that they hired, maybe they used some of them for the medical experiments, because clearly Nazis had some experience in that area. And then when it was discovered that the CIA was doing this, and keep in mind, the CIA is the federal government. I mean, that is a core element of the federal government. That when it was discovered they were engaged in these secret experiments, the CIA director just ordered all the documents destroyed as part of MK Ultra, because he didn't want people to discover the real details of what they had been doing to Americans without their knowledge or consent. So it kind of gives you an idea of how America was moving over to the dark side in the very beginnings of the national security state. Now we've got regime change operations at the same time. We've got a regime change operation in Iran that they tried to connect to the anti-communist crusade, that the communists are going to come to get us, and that the democratically elected prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, had nationalized British oil interests, which is sort of communistic, and therefore it's necessary to oust him from power. So they have this surreptitious coup where hundreds of innocent people are killed through riots that the CIA instigates in the streets. They oust Mossadegh from power. They install the Shah of Iran. The CIA teaches his secret police force in the art of torture and intimidation and oppression and tyranny. And for 25 years or so, the Shah rules with a brutal hand until 1979, when the Iranian people revolt and unfortunately are unable to establish the same kind of system that they had before under Mossadegh, and they end up with this dictatorial regime, which is really no different in principle than the Shah's regime of Ayatollahs. But it's all rooted back in the national security state. And so you can look at the relations with Iran today. It's all rooted in what the national security state did back in '53 under the guise of, hey, fighting the communists. And over here, I mean, there was the spying, surveillance schemes, the threats against Martin Luther King. I mean, anybody who was suspected of communist connections, if somebody had been a member of the Communist Party, they did everything they could to destroy his career. You had the Hollywood directors that were thrown out of Hollywood because they had had some kind of communist connection, had been a member of the Communist Party, and so forth. So here you had this huge Cold War, not only against the Soviets, but against communists. The Communist Party members were infiltrated, spied upon, intimidated, threatened. Some of them were sent to jail. It was an incredible period, and all because of this fear that the national security state was engendering in people of communists. I tell young people now when I go and give a lecture, I say, okay, you guys, like college students, have grown up under the war on terrorism, where you've been taught to be afraid that the terrorists are coming to get us, and Bin Laden's coming to get us, or Boko Haram, or Boko Haram, or whoever the latest enemy du jour is. That ours was communists and communism, and we were all taught, growing up, look under your bed for a communist because they could be there. And you had countless people who had their careers ruined because of this thing about communism. And so in Guatemala in '54, 1 year after the Iran coup, you've got the CIA again coming in with another coup to oust the democratically elected president there because he was a communist, and this was considered a grave threat to, quote, national security. And of course, nobody has ever been able to define national security, but it's become the two most important words in the American lexicon. I mean, all you got to do is, walk into some federal court and say national security, and the federal judge's knees are going to start shaking, and he's going to say, what should I do? What should I do? And he's going to try to keep everything secret, and that's what the FISA court's all about. And everything the national security state does and the other three branches of government, they get extremely nervous, and there's a lot of deference to authority there, complete deference to authority. And so you've got this ouster of this democratically elected president in Guatemala. It precipitates a civil war for 3 decades, where like more than 1 million people are killed. Again, because the communists are coming to get us. The communists are coming to get us. And of course, the best example was Cuba. I mean, here in Cuba were the roots of the assassination program today. Where the government today, the national security state, has the power to assassinate anybody they want. And the courts don't interfere with it. The Congress doesn't interfere with it. The president looks like he's in charge, but really the people who are in charge are the national security state, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, this fourth branch of government. That's who's in charge of all these programs, the surveillance programs, the assassination programs. And so you've got Cuba, where the CIA, now get this, the CIA in partnership with the mafia. I mean, imagine that. The mafia is this drug dealing, heroin selling, murderous organization. And here the U.S. government is partnering with this murderous organization to assassinate a man who happens to be the leader of a different foreign country. Now, we've all been brought up, at least those of us my age, that this was all justified. This was all okay. But how many people ever ask themselves, why was it okay? Why is it still okay to be going to assassinate somebody simply because? I mean, what was their rationale for assassinating or trying to assassinate Fidel Castro? The only rationale they had was that he believed in communism. Now, what does that mean? Well, part of it is he believes in socialism. In other words, he believes in things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare. I mean, Fidel Castro will tell you that his 2 proudest accomplishments are free health care for everybody in Cuban society and free education, public schooling. And he understands that these are core elements of socialism. But this was the reason why the national security state said, we have a right, we have the authority to assassinate this man because of the beliefs that he has in his mind, that he believes in communism, he believes in socialism. Now, if you look at the Constitution, there's certainly no authority granted to the government to assassinate people because of what they believe. In fact, there's not even a granted power to assassinate anybody in the Constitution. But this shows you this fundamental altering. There was also no grant to have these medical experimentations and these regime change operations and so forth. But here were the roots of the assassination program, because hardly anyone was asking, under what authority do you have to be assassinating this man? And then, of course, there was the invasion at the Bay of Pigs. There was Operation Mongoose, sabotage, acts of terrorism, all with the notion that the national security state was embedding in the American people that this is a grave threat to national security. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that the United States was going to fall into the ocean? Did it mean that the communists were going to take over the federal government and run the DEA and the IRS and the interstate highway system? I mean, it was a ridiculous, nonsensical fear from 1945 onward. There was never any cause for concern that Fidel Castro or anybody else became a communist leader of a foreign country. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because Castro's been in power, his brother now, they've been in power for, 5 or 6 decades or so? The United States is still standing. And this is what the CIA and the military were telling President Kennedy and telling President Eisenhower. We have to oust this man, because if we don't oust him, the United States will fall to the communists. Well, okay, the United States fell to socialists like Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon and so forth. But I mean, it's still standing as a nation. So it was all just a bunch of bull. It was no different from like when they justified their Vietnam War. That if we don't send troops into Vietnam, if we don't stop the North Vietnamese victory in the Civil War in Vietnam, the dominoes will fall, and finally the big domino will be the United States. Ridiculous, because Vietnam did fall, and the United States is still standing. In fact, if you look throughout Latin America, here's the real irony. If you look at Latin America today, you see nothing but leftist, not nothing, but you see a lot of leftist regimes now. Daniel Ortega, who Reagan was trying to oust from power over in Nicaragua, he's back in power. You've got a leftist in Chile. You've got leftists in Bolivia and all over Latin America. Now, that's not such a good thing for Latin Americans, but of course, their choice is either a right-wing dictatorship or a left-wing dictatorship. And so, yeah, you have to sympathize with that. But it certainly doesn't mean that the United States is going to fall into the ocean or be taken over by the communists and so forth. So the whole Cold War was really just a bunch of bull. This fundamental realtering of America's governmental structure and our society and what we're living with today was all unnecessary. And then, of course, if you jump ahead to 1973, you've got the Chilean coup. And how did they justify that? Now, Chileans will tell you that this was a military coup engendered by the Chilean military. That's just nonsense. They just don't want to acknowledge that it was the U.S. that instigated this coup, that orchestrated it. If it hadn't been for the U.S., the likelihood is that there never would have been a Chilean coup. And so, but why did the U.S. take this position? Because there was a communist who had been elected in Chile, Salvador Allende, and all of a sudden, threat to national security, threat to national security. Like what? What are they going to do? I mean, it's no different from like President Obama today declaring that Venezuela is a threat to national security because there's a leftist in power there. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous. And but that's what they did. And so while Chileans will say, oh, well, Pinochet had to oust Allende from power because of the horrible economic conditions, well, that's being disingenuous. Because what was really happening is that not only were Allende's economic policies, socialism causing chaos, but so was the CIA. Because Nixon had told the CIA, go in there and cause as much economic distress as possible. Make the Chilean people suffer. His words were, make the economy scream so that they will be ready for a coup. And there were people who opposed a coup, like the commanding general of all the Chilean armed forces, Rene Schneider. No problem. The CIA just orchestrated his kidnapping and assassination, and he was out of there, leaving a widow and 4 small children. The man was totally innocent. All he did was say, I'm going to stand up for the Chilean Constitution. But what they were teaching Chilean officials at the School of the Americas was, you have a duty to do this. You have a duty to violate your constitution and save the country. That's the job of this 4th branch of government, to oust a president who's threatening national security, even though it's not in the Constitution, even though it's not part of the legal structure. You have a duty to do this. And they finally pulled it off. And the result was horrendous. I mean, 40 to 50,000 people dead. Well, not dead, 3,000 dead, 40,000 rounded up. But most of them tortured, raped, abused, indefinitely incarcerated. I mean, it was just a horrendous tyranny. I mean, you couldn't find a better example of tyranny. It'd be difficult to do so. But what was the rationale? Well, it was the same rationale that Hitler had used and his Cold War, and that the U.S. had used in its Cold War. These were communists. And so what Pinochet was doing was having his national security branch of the government, because they had the same kind of branch, to oust the president, take control, and start rounding people up for what they believed. And that's all. I mean, there was a tiny minority that were taking up arms against this tyranny, which, of course, under the principles of the Declaration of Independence, they had a right to do, because this was classic tyranny. But since they had gun control in Chile, most people couldn't resist. He just rounded up people, kidnapped them, sent them into the torture chambers to be raped and tortured and executed or detained. And why? Because they believed in communism. And this is where this whole national security state apparatus took us during the Cold War. And the outgrowth of it is, once they lost communism and the Cold War and their Cold War enemy, they didn't just disintegrate. They didn't dismantle, which they should have done. They instead went out there and started provoking crises in the Middle East and producing terrorist retaliation, so that now we have formal programs of assassination that very well may have been modeled on Pinochet's DINA program, which was an international organization for assassination, one that assassinated the Chilean former foreign minister Orlando Letelier on the streets of Washington, D.C., and in which the CIA was a partner in DINA. And so here we have this now organized form of assassination, of torture, of regime change, sanctions, embargoes, Ukraine, Venezuela, ongoing crisis after crisis after crisis, and surveillance schemes. Let's not forget the secret surveillance schemes of the NSA. This is not what our founding fathers envisioned for us. This is not the type of government that was brought into existence in 1787. This is an alien form of government. These apparatuses, the national security state apparatus, the welfare state apparatus. The only way to achieve a free society is to now start re-examining what this country did. And I consider it, what they did with the national security state apparatus, the greatest mistake this country has ever made. And it's now embedded like a cancerous tumor onto the body politic. And what we need to do as Americans of our time, if we want to restore a peaceful, free, harmonious, moral society, there is one prerequisite to that, and that is to restore the founding principles of 3 branches of government and dismantle the 4th, the national security branch. That's the Libertarian Angle. We'll see you next week.